Paris burns. Smoke rises above the City of Lights not from fireworks or celebration, but from anger, from betrayal, from a nation cracking under its own weight. 1,000 protesters storm the railway station, chanting, clashing, refusing to be silent. For France, this feels like collapse. For Africa, it feels like justice catching up. At the very moment when Emmanuel Macron clings to power skating on thin ice, another story is unfolding across the Sahel. In Ouagadougou, a young soldier only 34 years old stands at the center of a storm much greater than Paris could ever imagine. His name is Ibrahim Traoré. To some, he is a savior. To others, a dangerous strongman. But to millions across Africa, he has become something else, a symbol of defiance against centuries of humiliation. This is not just about protests in France. It is about a turning tide. The colonizer trembling at home while the colonized rise abroad. The world asks, can Africa truly cut the chain, or will the past tighten its grip once more? The fuse is lit. France is burning. But the question is not whether Macron survives. The real question is, if France falls, does Africa finally rise? The streets of Paris echo with sirens. Tear gas clouds the air as riot police clash with citizens who refuse to accept austerity budget cuts and what they call betrayal from above. At the Gare du Nord, one of Europe's busiest railway stations, thousands tried to push their way inside, chanting for Emmanuel Macron to resign. Some shouted about lost holidays, others about rising prices. But beneath it all was the same raw feeling, a nation that no longer trusts its leader. Commentators speak of Macron skating on thin ice, barely holding the political machine together. Lumumba, the firebrand voice from Africa, warned bluntly, he can only escape the political guillotine for a short while, 1 year, maybe 2. His words cut deep, reminding Parisians of their own bloody history. And yet the chaos of Paris is not the full story. It is only the reflection of something far greater happening far south. Because while France shakes, Ouagadougou is building. And in that building, in the dust of Sahel towns, Ibrahim Traoré is rewriting the script. In September 2022, after 2 coups in less than a year, a young captain seized power in Burkina Faso. He was not the polished politician of Paris. He was a soldier from the north, hardened by war against jihadist insurgents and propelled into office by a people desperate for survival. The scenes could not be more different. In Paris, protesters carry banners demanding the right to keep their paid holidays. In Burkina Faso, villagers dig trenches by hand, hoping to slow the advance of militants who massacre indiscriminately. In Barcelona, over 600 people died in a single day as gunmen stormed a community trying to defend itself. Men, women, and children all cut down while their hands were still muddy from digging the earth. This is the contrast of our age. France protests the fear of losing comfort. Burkina Faso bleeds from the struggle of losing lives. And standing between despair and hope is Ibrahim Traoré, thrust into leadership by the gravity of his nation's suffering. To many Africans, Macron's troubles are poetic justice. For decades, France drained Africa's minerals, controlled its currency through the CFA franc, and dictated its politics from afar. Gold, uranium, oil extracted while villages sank deeper into poverty. When independence came in 1960, it was a shadow wrapped in treaties and debts that tied nations to Paris. Only Guinea dared to say no in 1958, and it was punished with sabotage and isolation. Traoré knows this history. He grew up with stories of Thomas Sankara, the legendary Burkinabe president who dared to break free from French dominance in the 1980s before being assassinated. For Traoré, Sankara was not just history, it was prophecy. A promise that one day someone would rise again to finish the mission. And so when the French were expelled from Burkina Faso in 2023, when their troops packed up and left Ouagadougou, the crowds filled the streets not in protest but in celebration. They waved Russian flags, Burkinabe flags, and banners of Sankara, shouting that at last the old empire was gone. In Paris, Macron faced jeers. In Ouagadougou, Traoré faced chants of loyalty. Yet under the celebration lies a question. Can a nation besieged by insurgency, cut off from Western aid and facing economic strangulation, truly build a new path? The symbolism is powerful. Paris burns while Ouagadougou dreams. But symbolism alone cannot stop bullets, cannot feed children, cannot heal the wounded. As Lumumba once said, history always catches up. For France, history is catching up in the form of protests and decline. For Africa, history is catching up in the form of a leader who dares to stand against centuries of control. But what happens when that history collides with the present? Can Ibrahim Traoré transform his people's pain into a new future? Or will the weight of war and poverty crush him before he has the chance? When Ibrahim Traoré first appeared on the world stage in his military fatigues, rifle slung across his shoulder, many outside Africa saw just another coup leader. But inside the continent, his image carried something far more powerful. He was only in his 30s, the youngest head of state in the world at the time. His youth was not a weakness. It was a spark, a reminder to millions of young Africans that leadership did not belong only to the old, the corrupt, or the obedient. Quickly his name began to travel beyond Burkina Faso. Murals of his face appeared on city walls in Bamako, Niamey, and Dakar. Social media lit up with his speeches, sometimes spliced with the fiery words of Sankara and Patrice Lumumba, blending past and present into a single defiant anthem. Hashtags like New Africa and Traoré Generation surged across the diaspora. For a continent often told that its leaders must seek permission from Paris or Washington, here was a soldier who spoke as if no one held the leash. It wasn't only his words that struck a chord, it was his symbols. When judges in Burkina Faso were told to abandon the black satin robes of French tradition and instead wear Faso don Fani, the hand-woven cotton of their ancestors, the moment went viral. What seemed like a simple change of clothing became a quiet revolution, justice draped not in foreign fabric, but in the cloth of the land. In that choice, Traoré sent a message louder than 100 speeches: we are no longer subjects. We are sovereign. In markets across Ouagadougou, vendors began to sell more Faso dan Fani, proudly pointing out that even the nation's courts had returned to tradition. School children were taught to honor Sankara's legacy not as a relic but as a roadmap. Songs praising Traoré echoed in football stadiums, mixing admiration with defiance. He became not just a president but a myth. Yet every myth carries its shadow. Western media painted him as an authoritarian, a man clinging to power by delaying elections, dissolving the Electoral Commission, and silencing critics. Human rights groups accused his army of massacres in villages like Nandine and Soro, where hundreds of civilians were killed under the fog of war against jihadists. His supporters brushed these off as propaganda, insisting he was the only one protecting the people from chaos. His enemies warned that he was simply replacing one form of oppression with another. But in the minds of many Africans, perception mattered more than politics. They did not see Macron trembling in Paris as the savior of democracy. They saw Traoré in Ouagadougou as the mirror of their own frustrations, their own dreams. If Sankara was the voice of the 80s, Traoré was the face of the 2020s. One Burkinabe farmer put it simply, "We don't need Paris to approve. We need someone to stand." And for now, Traoré is standing. The question remains, how long can a myth hold against reality? Can a symbol feed the hungry, protect the villages, and rebuild an economy cut off from Western aid? Or will the myth collapse under the weight of bullets, sanctions, and hunger? Symbols can ignite a movement, but they cannot hold a nation together on their own. Beyond the flags and slogans, Traoré has pursued concrete steps to reshape Burkina Faso's future. His government announced the nationalization of gold mines, insisting that the wealth buried beneath Sahel soil must serve Burkinabe families, not foreign shareholders in Paris or Toronto. Exports of raw gold were restricted with promises to build refineries and keep more value at home. For a country where nearly 70% of export earnings come from gold, this was not just economics, it was sovereignty written in stone. Traoré also turned to agriculture, launching projects to revive food self-sufficiency. New tomato processing plants were opened, a symbolic rejection of the humiliating reality where African nations exported raw crops only to import canned versions from Europe. Road networks were promised 5,000 kilometers of new roads each year to connect isolated villages, bring food to markets, and knit the nation together. These were the dreams of Sankara, reborn dignity through self-reliance. And yet the shadows remain long. Burkina Faso is still one of the hungriest nations on earth. Schools are shuttered in regions where jihadists roam freely. Millions are displaced, living in camps where food is scarce and hope is scarcer. International donors, once a lifeline, have withdrawn funds after Traoré's break with France and the West. The burden of rebuilding now falls on strained shoulders. Worse still are the accusations staining his army. Reports from villages like Nandine and Soro describe mass killings of civilians carried out under the banner of anti-terror operations. Families say their loved ones were rounded up, executed without trial. Human rights groups call it atrocity. The government calls it misinformation. Truth remains buried beneath grief. This is the paradox of Ibrahim Traoré. He promises freedom from foreign chains, but struggles to free his own people from violence and hunger. His supporters say give him time. His critics warn he is already becoming what he fought against, and so the nation waits balanced between hope and fear. In the bustling markets of Ouagadougou, the air is thick with the scent of roasted maize and fried peanuts. Women wrap themselves in brightly colored Faso Dan Fani, children weave through the stalls, and traders shout prices above the hum of motorcycle engines. On the surface, life goes on. But behind every conversation lies the shadow of war and the echo of politics reshaping the region. Since Traoré's rise, Burkina Faso has become more than a nation, it has become a symbol for the Sahel. Alongside Mali and Niger, it now stands at the heart of the Alliance of Sahel States known as AES. Together, these countries have expelled French troops, closed foreign bases, and declared their refusal to live under what they call neo-colonial chains. For decades, they were considered periphery states dependent on Paris for military support and financial aid. Today, they present themselves as a new bloc, sovereign, defiant, and unapologetic. The impact is visible in everyday life. School children recite new pledges, learning that their destiny lies not in Europe's approval, but in Africa's unity. University students in Bamako hold debates about a Sahelian currency to replace the CFA franc. Farmers in Niger boast that their uranium will no longer leave for free. It is as if the continent itself is rehearsing a new script, one that replaces dependency with dignity. But reality is less romantic. Burkina Faso remains under siege. In the north, jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS spread terror, displacing entire villages. In the east, bandits control highways, strangling trade. In the west, communities are split between loyalty to the state and fear of reprisals. For families forced to flee their homes, the alliance in the capital means little if they cannot return to their fields. And yet there is a current of pride flowing through the struggle. We are finally standing on our feet, one shopkeeper told a foreign journalist. Even if we stumble, it is better than kneeling. These words capture the paradox of the Sahel today, hardship combined with a stubborn sense of dignity. The AES has also altered the geopolitical balance. With France gone, Russia steps in, offering weapons, instructors, and promises of partnership. Chinese companies appear with blueprints for roads and bridges, trading infrastructure for access to minerals. Turkey supplies drones. The West calls it a dangerous drift. Local leaders call it diversification. For ordinary people, it is a gamble whether these new friends will truly treat Africa as equal, or whether they too will one day wear the mask of empire. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's reforms ripple through society. Courts dressed in traditional cloth spark debate. Is this a true break from colonial influence, or just symbolism to mask deeper problems? Factories that process local crops stand as monuments of pride, yet workers whisper about shortages and low wages. Soldiers march in parades with chants of Sankara lives, while their comrades in the field bury victims of yet another attack. Everywhere contradictions collide. The streets of Ouagadougou carry both celebration and mourning. Young men tattoo Traoré's face on their arms while mothers weep for sons lost at the front. In the diaspora, Africans rally in Paris, Brussels, and New York, waving Sahelian flags and calling Traoré a hero. In the same cities, others march against him, accusing his government of authoritarianism and bloodshed. This is the cost of rewriting history. Glory on one page, grief on the next. And yet momentum builds. Across the Sahel, talk of a federation grows louder. Leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso whisper about one day merging their armies, their resources, even their borders. For some, it is a dream of strength. For others, it is a fantasy doomed by rivalry. Still, the idea resonates with a population tired of division, tired of being told they are too weak to stand alone. So here lies the heart of the matter. France loses ground not just militarily, but in the imagination of millions. Once Paris dictated the terms. Now the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey dictate their own. The colonizer is no longer at the center of the story. The Sahel is. But can this fragile unity survive the storms of insurgency, sanctions, and hunger? Or will the dream of sovereignty crack under the same weight that once crushed Sankara? From Washington to Brussels, the rise of Ibrahim Traoré has not gone unnoticed. In the corridors of power, diplomats whisper about a Sahel drift, the sudden pivot of 3 African states away from France and by extension away from Western influence. To the United States, it is more than a regional crisis. It is a signal that Africa, long considered a partner to be managed, is becoming a player that chooses its own alliances. American officials publicly urge a return to democratic order, but privately they watch with unease. The Pentagon knows the Sahel is more than barren desert. It is a corridor of uranium, gold, oil, and rare earths minerals essential for the 21st century. If France has lost access and if Russia and China gain it, then the balance of global power tilts not just in Europe or Asia, but in Africa. For Washington, this is not about Traoré's speeches. It is about the mines beneath Sahel soil. Moscow, meanwhile, seizes the opportunity. Russian instructors arrive in Ouagadougou, their presence celebrated in parades where locals wave both Burkinabe and Russian flags. Propaganda paints Traoré as a new Sankara protected by Russian friendship. China plays a quieter game funding infrastructure, signing trade deals and offering the promise of development without lectures on human rights. For the people, the choice feels pragmatic. If Paris offered chains, perhaps Moscow or Beijing offers keys. But the West sees danger. European leaders warn that Traoré's embrace of Moscow will drag the Sahel into another proxy war. Human rights organizations issue reports accusing his government of massacre, suppression of free speech, and creeping authoritarianism. International media frame him as a populist strongman destined to fail. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, these critiques are dismissed as the same old colonial tune. The paradox deepens. In African cafes and classrooms, young people call Traoré Africa's Che Guevara, a revolutionary who dares to defy the empire. In Western think tanks, analysts call him a dangerous autocrat, no different from those who once destabilized the continent. Both sides may be wrong or both may be right. History provides the echo. During the Cold War, Africa was the battleground where Washington and Moscow fought for influence. Leaders like Lumumba, Nkrumah, and Sankara were caught between the promises of East and West, and many paid with their lives. Today, Traoré walks the same thin line. His choices could lift his nation or place it once again in the crossfire of giants. And so the question is not just what Traoré will do, but how the world will respond. Will the United States accept a Sahel that chooses Moscow over Paris? Will Europe adjust to a continent no longer under its thumb? Or will history repeat itself with Africa once again paying the highest price in a game it did not design? The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the Sahel is not yet finished. It is only beginning. From the crowded markets of Ouagadougou to the boardrooms of Washington, the question is whispered the same way. What comes next? One vision is full of hope. In this vision, Burkina Faso becomes a model of sovereignty, a country that transforms its gold and crops into factories, jobs, and schools. The Alliance of Sahel States deepens, creating a common defense force strong enough to repel insurgents and protect its people. A new Sahelian currency emerges, freeing millions from the grip of the CFA franc. Roads and railways connect once isolated villages, and the dream of Sankara finally breathes again in living form. But there is another vision, one far darker. In this vision, the insurgency grows stronger, bleeding villages dry and stretching the army beyond its limits. Sanctions from the West starve the economy. Accusations of massacres and repression erode Traoré's legitimacy at home and abroad. In desperation, he leans further on Moscow, further on Beijing, until sovereignty blurs into dependency once again. The very dream that promised dignity curdles into another cycle of pain. Between these two paths lies the truth, fragile, uncertain, and costly. Traoré has the fire of Sankara, but fire can both warm and consume. His youth inspires the continent, but youth can also mean impatience. His reforms awaken pride, but pride alone cannot fill an empty stomach. What is undeniable is this: France's shadow is shrinking. No matter what happens tomorrow, Paris will never again command Ouagadougou the way it once did. And that in itself is historic. Macron may fall. Le Pen may rise, but the Sahel has moved on. The stage is no longer set in Paris. It is set in Africa. As the drums of change beat louder, the question is not whether Ibrahim Traoré can hold power, but whether the movement he represents can outlive him. If it does, then the Sahel could mark the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa itself. Because history is not kind to those who wait. History rewards those who dare. France burns in protest. Paris trembles under the weight of its own contradictions. But the deeper story is not about Macron, nor about holidays lost or budgets cut. The deeper story is about Africa, about a continent that once bowed to the empire, now daring to rise in its own name. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré stands at the crossroads of hope and fear. He is not perfect. He is young, untested, and burdened by a war that swallows villages whole. His government faces accusations that stain its hands with blood. Yet for millions across Africa and beyond, he has become a symbol, a reminder that sovereignty is not granted, it is claimed. The road ahead is uncertain. The Sahel bleeds, but it also dreams. The old chains may be broken, but new ones wait in the shadows. The question is whether Africa will walk into another trap or finally forge a path of its own. This much is clear: Paris no longer writes the script. The pen has moved south into the hands of those who once had no voice. And whether that script becomes a tragedy or a triumph depends not only on Traoré, but on an entire generation that must choose courage over fear, unity over division, and dignity over dependence. So I ask you, is this Africa's turning point or just another chapter in a long struggle? Leave your word below, your vow, your hope, your warning. Write New Africa. Write Africa forward. Or write what your heart believes. Because this is not just a story of one man. This is history unfolding, and history, as always, demands witnesses.